welcome everyone. My name is Soyoung Lee. I'm the Landon and Lavinia Clay Chief Curator of the Harvard Art Museums, and I will be serving as moderator for our Q&A later on today. Before we begin today's program, the Harvard Art Museums acknowledge that Harvard University is situated on the traditional and ancestral territory of the Massachusetts people, and we strive to honor this relationship. Thank you so much for joining us today for today's Art Talk Live, New Frame Works for German Expressionism. And as you can see, our speaker has switched roles today. More about Lynette in a short while. So this ongoing series offers an up-close look at works from our collections with the staff of the Harvard Art Museums. You can join us on Zoom on every other Tuesday afternoon at 12:30 for these short interactive talks that investigate artists' materials and techniques, reveal our latest discoveries, and explore big ideas using the collections of the Harvard Art Museums. Though I am sure, Lynette, I think we're going to the next slide. Though I'm sure you're all Zoom experts at this point, I do want to quickly run down a few logistics before we begin. So as you can see, we're using the webinar format in Zoom. We invite you to submit brief questions via the Q&A box at the bottom, which you should be able to access throughout the talk, and you're welcome to submit the question at any point, but we will have a Q&A session following the talk. The presentation will last approximately 15 minutes or so, and we hope to dedicate the last 15 minutes to Q&A. So again, feel free to put your questions into the box throughout the presentation. We'll try to get to all of them, but we don't always if there are lots of questions. And now, without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce our speaker today, who will be very familiar to those of you who are regular listeners or regularly tune into this series. Lynette Roth is the Daimler Curator of the Busch-Reisinger Museum and head of the Modern and Contemporary Art at the Harvard Art Museums. Her research focuses on art from German-speaking countries with publications and exhibitions on the Weimar period, the immediate post-war period, and contemporary art. Her current projects include exhibitions on the photogram, which you'll see next spring, and issues of German art and identity after 1980. And today, Lynette will tell us the story of how a team of colleagues literally reframed the Busch-Reisinger Museum's paintings collection, recounting an effort to replicate lost originals and thus restore as closely as possible German Expressionist artists' original intent in advance of the Harvard Art Museum's reopening back in 2014. So with that, I'm delighted to warmly welcome Lynette. Take it away.
Great, thank you so much, Soyoung. And it is, I have to say, really nice to be on this side of things. We actually launched Art Talks Live pretty much about a year ago today. And I want to take this opportunity to thank my colleagues who work tirelessly behind the scenes to make this happen. Molly Ryan in our division of academic and public programs, and curatorial assistants from our 3 curatorial divisions, Matthew Rogan, Erica Lawton, and Bridget Hinz. And Bridget is the one helping us out this afternoon. So just a great thank you to all of them for the success of this wonderful program, which will continue throughout the summer and throughout the fall. As Soyoung said, my topic today is to kind of go back to a project that we did in advance of the opening of the new Harvard Art Museums in 2014. And it really was a moment for all the curators at the Harvard Art Museums to have an opportunity to take a closer look at their collections and completely reinstall them in the new building. And when we reopened in 2014, as the curator of the Busch-Reisinger Museum, I was asked constantly, what did you do to your German Expressionist collection? It just looks, so good. Did all of the paintings get restored by the Strauss Center in advance of the opening? And that praise, which I was very happy about, obviously extended even to the New York Times review of the Harvard Art Museum's new building and reopening. And my secret was actually not that we had restored or done anything really to the paintings themselves, except to prepare them for re-exhibit, but actually to the frames. So prior to the reopening of the museums, I had led a team in the reframing of nearly every single painting in the Busch-Reisinger's Level 1 gallery. So if you're familiar with the museum, you know that's a suite of 3 paintings galleries right near our cafe, which we can't wait to get back to. So the reason for thinking about German Expressionist frames is really because the artists themselves understood frames as integral to their paintings. So they often designed and carved and painted the frames themselves. And because those frames were often in line with Expressionists' own thinking about their work, wanting to kind of reduce to get back to a sort of idea of the natural or the simple, also moving away from bourgeois traditions in Imperial Germany at the time. Many of the frames, appeared very simple. And so the frames that were not already lost over the years were actually then replaced by art dealers and collectors and even museums, especially as the cost of Expressionist painting continued to rise. So you have to imagine, if you've got a very expensive, valuable painting, you want to give it that, golden, elaborate frame. Our new frames at the Busch-Reisinger Museum sought instead to replicate lost originals. And so we were trying to get back to, as closely as possible, the artist's original intent. And around the same time that I actually started this project, the Harvard Art Museums hired its first frame conservator, Allison Jackson, who then assisted with the project. And actually I have to thank Allison for all of the incredible before and after photos that we're going to use today. And again, this was a team effort, and you'll see much of that team throughout the presentation. I'm not going to name everybody in the interest of time, but I do have a shout out to all of them and all their names when we wrap up today. So the project began really with one painting in particular, and that was Ernst Ludwig Kirstner's self-portrait with cat, which you see here from 1920. And I started with Kirstner really because Kirstner, like many of his Brücke Expressionist colleagues, Erich Heckel, Carl Schmidt-Rottluff, Max Peckstein, Emil Nolde, right? For Kirstner, frames were central, as I said, to the artwork. And he conceptualized them holistically, as we can see in this quote, right? That the idea of exhibiting an unframed painting was, of course, something that he couldn't possibly imagine. And actually, I love this quote because he's showing also his own kind of frame nerdiness, and it resonated with me as well, because I also felt if we were going to reframe the collections, we were going to do it as properly and as well as possible. We can see here in a photo from 1910 some of the Expressionists' framing choices at the time that they were making the work. And again, you can see often these more simple profiles, which here really contrasts with this more opulent decor, the kind of marbled doorways and this ornate stucco at the Brücke exhibition. And it's surprising, actually, given how much attention the artists paid to their frames, that scholars really didn't pay much attention to Expressionist frames. And actually, when you think about, the catalogs that you've seen of German Expressionist painting, or even online resources, right, they don't actually include the frames, often again because the original frames have been lost to history. In the case of the Busch-Reisinger Museum, by the time the paintings were acquired, most of them were acquired after the Second World War in the 50s and the 60s. Those original frames had long been separated from the paintings themselves. And actually, we can see the Kirstner here in our former historic home, the Adolphus Busch Hall. And this was a photograph taken in the 1980s. And likely the frames that were put on the Busch-Reisinger paintings were done so with their acquisition after the Second World War by Busch-Reisinger curator Charles Kuhn, and pretty much stayed with a few exceptions in those frames until our project began. You can see the Kirstner here as well in the early 2000s in our former building of Werner Otto Hall. And it's important to say that also, given the precarious financial situation of the Busch-Reisinger Museum, especially in those early decades after the war, right, a frame was largely a means to an end. Thankfully, we had an endowment fund called the Care of the Busch-Reisinger Museum Collection that allowed us in advance of the opening to really embark on this project and to do it as properly and as well as possible. So I'm very grateful to the donor of that fund. So Kirstner, it was a great place to start because he was also one of the first artists to ever require copyright permission of his work. I mean, now we know that, right? If you are going to use an artist's image, you pay them for that copyright, or their heirs for that copyright. And in order to keep that kind of permission and keep track of his work, he also kept meticulous records. So he photographed them. And this was an incredible resource, especially for thinking about frames. Unfortunately, when I reached out to the Davos Museum archive in Switzerland, the Kirstner archive, the print from the glass negative that we see here of our painting did not show the painting in its frame. So that was a disappointing email to receive. However, the director at the Davos Museum, Karen Schick, recommended that I talk to Werner Maurer. And Werner is a framer, and he's based in Munich, and he's actually a specialist for Kirstner and German Expressionist frames, among many other frames. And so I went and visited Werner in his frame shop, and you can see a few images here of that visit, and also the consultation that we did using a large cardboard printout of our Kirstner, because of course, shipping the painting back and forth to Munich to have it framed was not possible for us. And Werner has this extensive database. He's been collecting images and information on existing Expressionist frames for a very long time. And so that also was a very important resource as we started looking at the Busch-Reisinger Museum collection. So after my visit to Munich, I actually found an archival photo of our painting. And I found it in the photographs that were taken by Nazi authorities as part of the infamous degenerate art campaign in 1937. So after the painting was removed from the collection of the Folkwang Museum by the Nazis, it was photographed. And so that gave us what we were looking for and what we needed. And that was an image of the original frame. And you can see it here that it has a mitered corner. So these kinds of details became very important. That means a corner that is joined at the diagonal. And it likely had a bronzed finish because that was very typical of the artist. And even though this is a black and white photograph, we can sort of see that sheen. So while he was in Switzerland, when he painted this self-portrait, Kirstner actually worked very closely with a carpenter named Paul Müller, and Müller would deliver the frames to Kirstner untreated so that he could actually determine the color of the frames himself. And typically he used a kind of greenish gold bronze, and really took the painting itself into consideration while he was finishing the frame. And so we had Werner Maurer and his team send us frame profiles with various bronze finishes so that we could actually hold them up to our painting and determine which finish worked the best. And so now I just want to show you the sort of before and after here with the original photograph of the frame, and on the right, the previous frame, which, as I said, was likely from the 1950s, and it had a kind of winged profile, and there was actually a fairly ill-fitting linen liner on the inside, which also was a sign that it was from the 50s, because linen was very big at that time. And then here is our finished replica frame of the Kirstner with that beautiful mitered corner and the gold bronze pigmented paint. And so once that was done, the painting was ready then for eventual installation in the new Harvard Art Museums. So just to give you a sense of the different kinds of frames that we did make, the Kirstner belongs to a group that I refer to, hopefully not too confusingly, as the original replica frames. So that's where we knew exactly what the frame looked like based on historic documentation, and we did our best to recreate it. So in addition to the Kirstner, we did that with Nolde's Mulatto, which you see here at the lower left. It had also been removed from a German museum as part of the Degenerate Art campaign, and was even featured in the Nazis' exhibition in 1937. And that's actually where, again, this photograph comes from. So thankfully, we actually had that resource to rely on. And here is a before and after, which is a little less dramatic perhaps than the Kirstner, because the museum had at a certain point tried to get closer to Nolde's original intent. And it might look like one of those like spot the difference games that you play with your kids. But actually, if you look closely, you can see that the former frame on the left has a shinier finish, and it also has a more visible wood grain. And here's a detail, hopefully you can see that a little bit better, that the former frame also had one of those mitered corners, which is actually a much more refined profile. But between 1910 and 1930, Nolde and also Heckel and Kirstner and Pechstein started using what Kirstner referred to as slat frames. So in German, the word is Bretterrahmen. And those were usually made of a carnivorous wood with visible knots and grains. So in fact, our former frame had been pretty close in getting to that. And then they were either finished with that gold bronze or they were painted, and they were often painted black. Now, our Nolde frame that we recreated was actually a combination of a slat frame, but it also had a mitered edge. So again, you're going to do it as properly as possible. And so that was the finished result, which you see on the right, and here also finished and getting packed back up in advance of the opening. Here's another example, Carl Schmidt-Rottluff's Still Life from 1913. On the left, a photograph in our files of it in the original frame, and on the right in the previous frame. And you can see from the photo on the left that Schmidt-Rottluff is using, like Otto Müller and Erich Heckel also did. It's a very simple half-rounded profile. And actually it kind of draws on Baroque frames, but here it's made out of pine. And so Werner Mohr's frame shop made us also that replica frame. And again, we did the same kind of a gold bronze finish, also working closely with the original painting. And in fact, I should say, you know, this frame also has a kind of black patina on it. And many of the frames were, you know, they were being made brand new, but were supposed to look like they were 100 years old or more than 100 years old. And so often patina was added, and Mohr's frame shop team in some cases actually took the frames out into the gravel yard and like smashed them on the ground in order to actually beat them up a little bit so that they didn't look newer than the painting that they were housing. Here we have another wonderful example, our Otto Müller, a nude in a landscape. And we had this photo also in our file from around 1928. You can see Otto Müller, the artist, in the center in front of the painting in its original frame. And actually in this case, Werner Moore had that existing pine frame profile already in his shop and based on an original frame. And so that was a pretty quick and easy switch from the before frame on the left to the after on the right. And so my own research also continued as this project advanced, and I read lengthy German dissertations on expressionist frame profiles and also began to look in German museums at original examples to also get a better sense of many of the examples that Werner Moore was also relying on. And just as I wrap up, a few other ways that we approached the topic. If we didn't have clear documentation for what the frame originally looked like, we did one of two things. And one was to take historic frames and resize them for our paintings. So we did that in the example of Alexei von Jawlensky's Head of a Woman from around 1911. And that would have been at the time framed in a black frame with a gilded lip. And this is the final result. As you see here, you can tell this is a more recent photograph taken during the pandemic. And we did consider making a new frame that looked like that. And then in the end, used a historic frame from Werner Moore's extensive inventory that instead of making a new one, and had that resized to fit our painting, really to a wonderful result. We did that also, for example, with Paula Modersohn-Becker's birch tree in a landscape. And here I had a lot of fun because I actually used a pine frame that Werner had that also had this wonderful knotty wood grain that I thought really also picked up on and responded well to the birch tree in Modersohn-Becker's composition. And then just a few more examples of paintings where we didn't know what the frame originally had looked like. We made replica frames based on others that we knew from the time. So our Erich Heckel landscape with bathing women got what's called a true slat frame. So it has a very flat profile. It doesn't have that extra mitered edge that the Nolde has, and was painted black. And that was based on a frame from a painting from around the same time, an original frame in the collections of the Munich museums. And you can see here also was a very common profile for the Brücke group and really defined their identity. Those are Kirstner frames that you see on the right, but very, very similar, those slat frames. And here you can see the Nolde and the Heckel in our gallery on exhibition, and really signaling in some ways that group identity. I want you to notice here also too the incredible flatness of those frames. As we turn to our final frame, which is a frame for our later Jawlensky from around 1924, and really where taking the frame project and taking the artist's original intent really meant actually making a frame that was quite surprising and really in some ways not expected when you think about the work that Jawlensky was making in the 1920s on this very abstracted head, rather than have it in a mat, almost like a work on paper like it was before. we reconstructed this historic frame that the artist had made together with a sculptor named Josef Benecki. And in fact, these are called Benecki frames because of the collaboration between painter and sculptor. And it has this incredible ornamental molding and this gilded wooden frame, which is quite striking. And you can see in the gallery also really gives the work a very different and the intent of that was to give it also a very different kind of sculptural presence. So that is a quick run through of our extensive project. And I just want to say that we are continuing our frame projects at the Harvard Art Museums. And in 2019, Werner Moore exhibited many frames and many examples of historic Brücke Group artists' frames in an exhibition in Berlin and near Munich. And there is a catalog, which is actually like beautiful, but also gigantic. And it is only in German. So for those of you who do read German, I highly recommend it. And Bridget's going to put in the Q&A or in the chat a link to an online version of that, just so you can see the incredible frames of the German Expressionists. And before we turn to questions, I just want to use this as an opportunity to thank all of my colleagues who contributed to our reframing of the German Expressionist collection back in 2012 and 2013. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Lynette, for a most illuminating talk and really fun. It was wonderful for me to go on that journey with you since you know, I wasn't there when you were doing this research and the reframing, but just really striking also how the overall thrust and your intention and the result is really about getting closer to the artist's original intent, right? It's true that I think many of us don't necessarily think as much about the framing of an artwork, and particularly with the German Expressionists, as you pointed out, how much that is so integral to their presentation, to actually the conception of the work itself as well. They really do make a difference. And the last one was surprising, as you point out. So I am going to check the question. Whoa.
Oh, I was going to say, in fact, for the last one, even Werner Moore said, Lynette, you sure you really want to go with the Benecki frame? You know, so, and I said, look, we've kind of started down this road. We're gonna do it 100%. So, and I love it, actually. I think it's.
So there's a quick question about when you talked about taking the frame and beating it, and there's a quick question about, do you think the artist would have wanted the frames to be beaten up on gravel to look old?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, especially because they actually dedicated as much time and energy often to the frames as they did to the paintings. I mean, in the case of Nolde, you know, these elaborate carvings that he starts doing after 1913. So no, probably not. And we wouldn't do it with an original frame, but it was more to, in some ways, let the painting feel that it had the life, or let the frame would feel that it had the life that the painting had also had. And I have to say, it makes a difference when I think about that Nolde frame that I showed you, which again, you know, was done before my tenure at the museum, but got very, very close to the artist's original frame. The shininess of it, that sort of glossiness of it, and just the, you know, it didn't sort of sing the way that the matte black and the, you know, so again, I think that patina, and in some cases was more than in others, kind of made it feel like they had never been separated.
There's a comment actually about the Kirstner. I think that's what the person is referring to. The first main painting you showed, right? Said points out that there's actually a framed picture or mirror in the painting itself. Is that correct, in the background? And would such images sometimes also serve as evidence? or not?
That is a fantastic question. Although in this case, I read that actually as a window out into the landscape.
Aha. Okay.
But some people, also think it could be a painting on the wall. And in fact, the Expressionists also did many paintings and many drawings and prints of their studios and of their work in situ. So yes, I mean, I think any kind of historic documentation that we can find that shows us those framing conventions, is a fantastic resource. And thankfully, there are photographs, which of course, are the most definitive for us. Also, in a case like this, it's black and white, but also Werner Moore, having looked at so many original Kirstner paintings and frames, he said, okay, well, this is obviously the gold bronze technique, and we know that he was doing it at that time. So we kind of brought all of that information together, but that's a great observation.
So here's another question. Since some of the dealers around World War II in the US worked closely with the German Expressionist artists, for example, Max Beckmann, did you come across any examples of artists providing guidance on how to exhibit their works? Were there records of destructions of frames, or do those sources not exist?
So just a point of clarification, because it's something that I'm very particular about. Max Beckmann was not a German Expressionist, although he's often grouped in with the German Expressionists. And he was someone who actually didn't care very much about his frames. And we did do a frame treatment on our Max Beckmann triptych, and to get it back to an original frame, but actually, and I can just pull up a quick picture, it was actually a dealer frame that had been made for the triptych at the time and had been the original collector's frame as well. In terms of the actual destruction of frames, I think actually most of the destruction of frames where we really didn't have any frame at all actually happened in the case of our collection, really with the Degenerate Art campaign. So often, even if that painting like the Nolde was shown in its frame, that exhibition and the traveling versions of it were notorious for also taking paintings out of the frames in order to actually devalue them, right? And also make them look rougher and less finished and, worth really the energy and resources that had been spent on them in those museum collections. So it is interesting to think, what does a frame do? And often a frame implies, and I think that's why so many collectors thought, well, I'm going to put my Kirstner in a really beautiful golden frame, right? They were elevating it to a status they felt was more appropriate, or just their own aesthetic choices.
There's a question regarding, you mentioned 3 types of approaches to the reframing, and you talked about taking an original frame and resizing to fit our works. And a question about, isn't resizing, so cutting down an original historic frame, damaging an original work, i.e. the frame? Wouldn't replicas suit the purpose? So since you did do replicas, why not in that case?
Yeah, it's a great question. And actually, I thought a lot about that as well. These were not frames where they were Jawlensky frames or specific frames for any identifiable artist, right? So what Werner Moore has done a lot of is actually matching back up if he comes across what he knows is an original, and there are other people doing this work as well, will then try and find actually the original frame or the painting that originally belonged to that frame. So it's not like there's a Modersohn-Becker that would have had that frame, or the Jawlensky that would have had that frame, but rather it's just, this was a very common framing technique at the time. And there are these historic frames that, are basically around and are collected as an inventory. But it's true, once it's resized, it has been changed forever. And I also think then we'll also I certainly hope, be with our painting forever. So in some ways, that is the effect that that has.
Thank you. There's a question about whether the frames have impact on the life of the canvas, and therefore when you were reframing, did that sort of preservation of painting portion or conservation, was that part of the project?
Oh, yes. And in fact, among the many names at the end were our conservators from the Strauss Center for Conservation and Technical Studies. So our paintings lab was deeply involved in this project as well. And, most of the frames that we had on the paintings had already taken into account what the paintings needed in terms of, how much support they needed. They'd all been restored at some point or made secure in those frames. And so when we were doing the replica frames, we made sure that they obviously met the same standards. And the Moore shop works with museums all the time. And so those standards were very familiar to them as well. So, but it really was a collaborative project.
Thank you, Lynette. We've got some really great questions and also comments, also just sort of thanking you and congratulating and people's own thoughts on this topic. Maybe we could close with a quick question about if you could just talk briefly about when we acquire contemporary works by contemporary artists, are we able to, or do we, as standard practice, consult artists on their preferred framing?
Yes, we do. And in fact, many artists also have very strong opinions about how they want their work to be framed or, beyond framing, exhibited. And we actually document all of those preferences. And in more recent years, our Strauss Center for Conservation has done extensive artist interviews that also document not just their framing preferences, but really kind of all of their preferences for the care of their work into the future. So it's really one of those things where, we're actually lucky we have the kind of documentation. And again, thanks to the research of, of many people now on German Expressionist frames, that documentation really informs every decision that we make, historic artists and well.
Thank you, Lynette. And we're going to have to wrap up here. There were a couple of questions in there about further reading or other resources, which I believe we'll be sending, if I'm not mistaken, in a follow-up email. So watch out for those, please. So thank you, everyone. There's some 200 people who originally joined into this talk for spending this Tuesday afternoon with us. After you leave the session, you will receive a link to a short online survey, which I hope you'll take a moment to complete. And we're very grateful for your feedback. And I also would like to warmly invite you to our next art talk 2 weeks from today on Cape Cod with Edward Hopper, presented by curator Joachim Holman. So that's Tuesday, July 13th at 12:30. And you can find the link to register for that and information about other upcoming programs on our online calendar. Thank you again, Lynette. And she will be back as moderator in her usual position at the next art talk. But thank you for a fantastic presentation, and thank you all again for joining us. And I bid you a good afternoon.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.